There is a kind of loneliness that wears the shape of strength. A man can armor himself against a great many things. He can grow proof against pity, against flattery, against fear, against the whole bright machinery of a world that wants his name and his fortune, and nothing of the man who carries them. When a dead man's will forced a stranger's daughter upon him, the Duke of Wrexholm despised her before she ever crossed his threshold, certain she was one more clever creature come to warm herself at his fire. He had braced for tears. He had braced for coaxing. He had not, in 5 long years, braced for anyone to ask him a single honest question in the dark. And that, in the end, was the thing that undid him. The road into the fells ran upward into weather. Rain came sidelong off the high ground, thin and cold as a needle, bleeding the last brown light of the afternoon into slate. Bryony Weld sat very straight on the hard seat of the hired chaise, her gloved hands folded over the small valise that held everything she owned, and watched the country grow meaner and higher and lonelier with every turn of the wheels. She was 23 and did not feel it. She felt, most days, like something left too long out in the cold, worn smooth and hard and useful, the way a stone in a riverbed is useful. Her pelisse had been her mother's. The wool still sound at the seams, though the color had faded to a tired gray. Beneath it, she wore her one respectable gown, and beneath that, a resolve she had been hammering into shape for 9 days, ever since the lawyer had come to the cottage with his soft voice and his black gloves, and told her exactly how neatly she had been sold. The will had been her grandfather's. Old Harcourt, the earl she scarcely remembered, a man of iron opinions who had died, convinced he was right. Years ago, in the manner of proud men arranging the world to their liking, he had struck a contract with the old Duke of Wrexholm. 2 great houses joined, a Weld daughter for a Wrexholm heir. It had seemed a fine thing then, when the Welds still had money and the Wrexholms still had 2 living sons. Then her father died in debt, and her grandfather died soon after, and both the fortune and the second son went into the ground, and the contract lay forgotten in a solicitor's box, like a loaded pistol no one recalled leaving on the shelf. Josiah Rook had recalled it. Rook was her father's cousin, a soft man with a wet mouth and eyes that were forever counting. When her father died, the guardianship of the 2 Weld girls and the management of all they still held had fallen to him, and he had treated that trust for 3 years the way a fox treats a hen roost. Bryony had watched the good horses sold, the plate sold, the tenants squeezed, the accounts kept in a hand too careful to be honest. She had said nothing, because saying things to men like Rook only taught them to watch you closer. She had waited instead, and kept her sister safe, and told herself that waiting was a kind of strength as well. Then the lawyer came. The old contract, he explained, wasn't dead at all. Her grandfather's will had teeth in it, the whole of what remained to the family, and every last shilling of her young sister's portion was bound in a trust that would only pass clean and whole to the girls if the marriage the 2 old men had promised was made good. Bryony was to marry the Duke of Wrexholm. If she did, her sister Ottilie would have her dowry, her small freedom, her future. If she did not, if the marriage failed, or was refused, or ended in scandal, the trust dissolved, and every acre and every coin fell to the man who administered it. To Rook, she had understood the shape of it in a single breath. It was elegant, the way a snare is elegant. A quiet, successful marriage would lock the money away from Rook inside the girl's trust forever. What he wanted was for the marriage to happen, and then to fail, loudly, in a fashion he could lay at her feet. He wanted the Duke to cast her off. He wanted a scandal with her name on it, so that he might stand before the court and swear the Weld girl had shamed the bargain, that the fault was hers, that the trust must therefore come to him, and little Ottilie with it. He had begun already. Letters had gone ahead of her into the north. She was sure of it. Letters in Rook's careful hand. Painting for the Duke of Wrexholm, a grasping, ambitious spinster who had schemed to trap a wounded recluse into marriage. He would have made the Duke hate her before ever she arrived, for a Duke who hated his bride was a Duke halfway to throwing her out. She might have run, but running took money she did not have, and it left Ottilie portionless forever, a pretty penniless girl of 16, alone in a world that ate such girls without salt. Running was not strength. Running was only fear in traveling clothes. So she had not run. She had packed her mother's pelisse and kissed her sister's brow and promised her, with a steadiness she did not feel, that all would be well, and climbed into the hired chaise and pointed it north, toward a man that everyone in 3 counties agreed was half a monster. She knew what they said of him. The scarred recluse of Ravensfell, who received no callers, who had turned his back on the world after the fire that took his brother and half his north wing 5 winters past, and had come out of it with his right hand burned to a ruin and his temper burned worse. Bryony was not afraid of any of it. She had lived 3 years under Josiah Rook's counting gaze, and a scarred and angry man held no special terror for a woman who had learned the far colder cruelty of the smiling sort. Whatever the Duke of Wrexholm was, at least, she suspected, he did not smile. The chaise crested a long rise, and the driver jerked his chin at the valley below without turning round. There it was. Ravensfell Hall. It was not a house so much as a fortress that had given up on war and settled into mourning. Gray stone gone black with rain, rising in blunt towers against a blacker sky. And there, at the north end, unmistakable even through the downpour, the ruin. A whole wing stood roofless and gutted, its windows empty sockets, its stones streaked where fire had climbed them years ago, and no one had come to mend them. It looked like a wound the house had decided to live with, the way a man learns to live with a limp. Bryony looked at that burned wing a long moment as the chaise rolled toward the gates. A house that keeps its ruin standing, she thought, is a house that has not finished grieving. The chaise halted on the gravel before the great door. The driver did not stir to help her, so she opened it herself, paid him the last of the coins Rook's grudging hand had allowed her, and watched the chaise rattle away up the drive, leaving her alone with her valise on the steps of a stranger's grief. The door opened before she reached it. An old man stood in the gap, thin and upright in worn black, with the face of a servant who had seen a great deal and expected to see worse. He took in her sodden pelisse, her cheap valise, her wet boots, and his expression did not change. "Miss Weld." It was not a question. "I am Holden. His Grace is expecting you." He said the word expecting the way another man might say dreading. "Thank you." She stepped past him into a hall so vast and cold, her breath smoked in it. Somewhere far off, a clock was ticking, slow as a failing pulse. "You need not look so grim on my account, Mr. Holden," she added. "I know precisely how welcome I am. It will spare us both a great deal of pretending." Something that was almost respect moved behind the old butler's eyes and was gone. "This way." He led her down a long gallery to a set of double doors, paused, knocked once, and opened them without waiting for a reply. The room beyond was a library, warm, and after the tomb of the hall, the warmth struck her like a hand. A great fire burned in a hearth, wide enough to roast an ox. Books climbed every wall into shadow, and at the far end, black against the tall streaming window, a man stood with his back to her, one hand braced on the sill, watching the rain fall on the ruin of his house. For a long moment he did not turn. Bryony stood dripping on the carpet and made herself study him, because you must always take the measure of a thing before it takes the measure of you. He was tall, built heavy through the shoulders, in a way that spoke of hard riding rather than soft living. Everything in the set of his back said, "Go away." Then he turned, and she saw the scar. It was not the horror the gossips had promised. The left side of his jaw carried the fire's mark, a smooth, silvered patch that tugged at the corner of his mouth, and his right hand, when he lifted it from the sill, was worse, the skin drawn and glazed, 2 fingers stiffened. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Dark and flat and gray, they moved over her with an insolence so complete it was almost restful. He had read Rook's letters and built a woman out of them, and that woman stood before him now, and he despised her exactly as much as he had planned to. "So," he said. His voice was low and rough, a voice that did not get much use. "The bride." "Your Grace," she curtsied. "You made good time." He crossed to a table where a decanter stood, and poured himself a measure without offering her any, and drank it, watching her over the rim. "I confess, I looked for you to be prettier. The letters gave me to expect a great beauty who had schemed most cleverly to land herself a duke." He set the glass down. "You do not look like a schemer, Miss Weld. You look like a governess, someone left out in the rain." The insult was meant to land. She let it. "I am neither a beauty nor a schemer, Your Grace," she said evenly. "I am a debt being paid. Yours as much as mine, as it happens. We were both sold by dead men. I see no cause to pretend either of us is here by choice." Something flickered across his face. Not warmth, attention. He had looked for her to flinch, or to flatter, or to weep, and she had done none of the 3, and it had cost him a half-second of the certainty he wore like armor. "How refreshing," he said, and the flatness came back down over him like a blind. "Then we understand one another. You will marry me on Thursday, because a paper says you must, and because I would sooner wed a stranger in the rain than let a lawyer prize 1 stone from this house. And after Thursday, you will keep to your rooms, and I to mine, and we will be strangers under one roof." He turned back to his window. "Holden will show you where you sleep. Do not go near the north wing. Do not go near the horses. And do not, on any account, imagine this is the beginning of anything." "I imagine nothing, Your Grace," she said to his back. "I have found it spares a great deal of disappointment." She thought as she went that she heard him make a sound. It might have been contempt. It might, just possibly, have been the ghost of a laugh. She did not turn to learn which. They were married on Thursday, in the small stone chapel at the edge of the estate, with the rain still falling, as though it meant to wash the whole north of England into the sea. It was the coldest wedding Bryony could imagine. There were no guests. The vicar was old, and hurried through the words as though he had somewhere warmer to be. Halden stood witness on one side, and a stiff, disapproving housekeeper, named Mrs. Tolliver, on the other. And there was no one else in the whole echoing chapel but the bride, the groom, and the god. They were both, she suspected, privately doubting. The Duke wore black, and looked as though he attended a funeral, which in a manner of speaking he did. He gave his responses in a flat, hard voice, each word set down like a coin he resented spending. The vicar named him Alaric Hale. She had not known, until that moment, his Christian name. When the moment came to put the ring on her finger, he took her hand without tenderness, and she felt the strange country of his scarred fingers against hers, and did not flinch, and felt him notice that she did not flinch, and resent that too. The ring was a heavy old thing, gold worn thin, warm from his pocket. It had belonged, she would learn later, to his mother, and that he had given a stranger his mother's ring rather than buy her a new one was the first thing about him she did not understand, and the first thread, though she did not yet know it, of everything that came after. "You may kiss the bride," said the vicar without conviction. The Duke looked at her then, for the first time since she had entered the chapel. For a moment, they only regarded one another, two strangers bound for life by the greed of a cousin and the pride of dead men. Then he bent and pressed his lips to her cheek. Once, briefly, a thing as cold and formal as a seal pressed into wax. "There," he said quietly, only to her. "It is done. You have your Duke, Miss Weld. I hope he brings you joy." "You may use my name now, Your Grace," she said. "We are married. Surely that entitles me to a Christian name from my own husband." His jaw tightened. "I do not know your Christian name." "No," she agreed. "You never asked it. It is Bryony." Something moved in the gray eyes, quick and gone. He straightened without answering, and offered her his arm because the vicar was watching, and they walked back down the aisle as man and wife, not touching more than they must, two people carved from the same cold stone. The wedding breakfast was a joyless thing, taken in a dining room opened for the occasion after long disuse, the fires too new to have driven out the damp. They sat at opposite ends of a table built for 20. He drank. She ate, because she had learned long ago that pride is a luxury and a full belly a strength, and she would need her strength. They did not speak. Outside the light failed, and the rain went on, and somewhere in the dark stables a horse was screaming. It screamed on and off through the whole meal, a wild, tearing, furious sound, and each time it came, the Duke's shoulders drew tight, and Mrs. Tolliver by the door pressed her lips together, and no one said a word of it. Bryony set down her fork at last. "Your Grace, what ails that horse?" "Nothing that concerns you. I told you to leave the horses be. I asked what ailed him, not for leave to saddle him." "That," said the Duke with a terrible flat weariness, "is Erebus, a black Spanish devil who has put 2 grooms in their beds and bitten a 3rd. And he screams like that most nights. And there is nothing to be done for him but the pistol, which I have not yet had the heart to use. Does that satisfy you, madam?" He rose and dropped his napkin on the table. "It grows late. Mrs. Tolliver will show you to your chamber. I trust you will not expect me." And he was gone, limping into the dark of the house, before she could tell him that she had expected nothing of him at all, and that this was precisely why, in the days to come, everything he did would take her so entirely by surprise. Her wedding chamber was cold and grand and unloved, and she lay in it a long while listening to the horse scream and the rain fall, and sleep would not come. It was the sound of the animal in the dark that held her, that furious, tearing cry, rage and terror so tangled they had become the same thing. She knew that sound. She had felt it herself in the years under Rook's roof, the wild, helpless fury of a creature handled cruelly until it can no longer tell a kind hand from a cruel one. You could not leave a thing to scream like that. Whatever the Duke said, you could not simply leave it. So she rose, wrapped her mother's pelisse over her nightgown, took up her candle, and went out into the sleeping house to find her way down to the stables, because she could not lie still while something wept in the dark. She never reached them. Passing the library, she saw that the great door stood ajar, and that within was not firelight, but the small, lonely gold of a single candle, and she stopped, because she saw him. The Duke sat in a low chair, drawn up to a hearth, gone cold and gray. He had not lit the fire. He sat in the dark of his own great house on his own wedding night, a decanter untouched at his elbow, not drinking, not reading, and not sleeping. He held something cupped in his two hands, the ruined one and the whole one together, as carefully as a man holds water, and his face, unguarded, was not the face of a duke or a monster. It was the face of someone standing at a graveside, and it was the loneliest thing she had ever seen. She should have gone. Any woman with sense would have crept back to bed and left him his grief. But Bryony had spent her life walking toward wounded things, not away from them, and she could no more leave him in that dark than leave the horse to scream. She pushed the door. His head came up at once, the change instant and terrible. The grief slammed shut behind the flat gray eyes. His body went rigid, his hands closing hard around the small thing he held as though to hide it. When he spoke, his voice was pure ice. "Get out." "No," she said. She did not know why she said it, only that it was the truest thing she had said all day. "I gave you an order in my own house. Get out, or I will have you carried out." "You will not." She came in quietly, and she did not go to him, which even then she understood was the important thing. She sat in the chair opposite his, across the cold hearth, and looked at him with no fear and no pity and no design. "You will not have me carried anywhere, Your Grace, because that would mean a servant must see you as you are now, and you would sooner die than be seen. I know. I have been that way myself." His scarred jaw worked. She had said something that landed too near the bone, and he hated her for it, and could not look away from her for it, both at once. "You know nothing about me," he said. "That is true. I know your name and your title, and that you can be cruel when you are frightened. I do not know the important things at all." She looked at his cupped hands, then away, giving him that. "But I know grief when I see it. I buried both my parents. I know exactly what that chair feels like." The candle guttered. Outside, the horse had gone quiet, as though even it were listening. And then Bryony asked him the question. It rose out of her from some place deeper than strategy, and she asked it gently, plainly, without a scrap of pity. "Will you tell me his name?" The Duke went very still. "Your brother," she said into his stillness. "The one no one here will speak of. I have been in this house 2 days, and no one has said his name once. They call it the fire, and the tragedy, and that terrible year, as though he were a season and not a boy. And I have been thinking it is a terrible way to be dead, to have everyone who loved you agree, out of kindness, never to say your name again." Who was he? For a long moment she thought he would strike her, or scream, or call for Holden. His breath came ragged, his ruined hand trembling around the small thing it held. She watched the years of armor strain against one simple question, the way a dam strains. And then, in a voice she had not heard him use, a voice with the ice gone out of it, and nothing left but the raw and shaking truth, the Duke of Rexholm said, "Tobias." The word came out of him as though torn loose. He opened his cupped hands, and she saw what he held. A small painted miniature in a tarnished silver frame, a boy of 19 with laughing eyes and an unscarred, living face. "Tobias," he said again, and his voice broke clean in half on it. "He was my brother. He was 19. I called him Toby." He drew a breath that shuddered all the way down. "No one has spoken it to me in 5 years. They think it a mercy." "It is not a mercy," Bryony said softly. "No." He looked up at her, and the flat gray eyes were not flat at all now, but wet and wide and astonished. At her, at himself, at the wall he had lived behind 5 years, walked through at last by the woman he had married that morning and meant never to speak to again. "No, it is not." They sat in the dark a long time after that, the dead boy's face between them, and neither said anything else, because nothing needed saying. Something had shifted in the cold room, some buried thing turning over in its sleep. And when at last she rose and wished him good night, the Duke sat looking at the closed door a very long while, holding his brother's name in his mouth, like the first swallow of water after a drought. He did not yet know what she was, but he knew, for the first time since Toby died, that he wanted to find out. In the morning, the world had rearranged itself very slightly, in the way of worlds after a long fever breaks. Nothing was said. That was the first rule of Ravensfell, she was coming to understand. Nothing was ever said. But when she came down to the cold breakfast room, she found a fire had been lit there, a proper roaring one, and that the place laid for her was not at the far distant end of the great table, but near the head, only one seat down from the Duke's own, and that there was chocolate and warm bread and honey, which had not been there the day before. She said nothing of it, neither did he. He was behind a newspaper 3 days old, and he grunted when she wished him good morning, and that was all. But he had moved her chair. She had a lifetime of practice in noticing the things a man did when he could not make himself say the things he felt. "I'm going to look at your horse this morning," she told the newspaper. The newspaper lowered. The gray eyes regarded her, and there was the old resistance in them. But something new lay underneath it now, a wariness that was almost, she thought, protectiveness. "Erebus has put 2 men in their beds," he said, "one of them for a month. I will not have you hurt to satisfy your curiosity, madam. I have quite enough ruined things under this roof." "I did not ask your leave, your grace," she said, buttering her bread. "I informed you of my intention, as a courtesy, so you would know where to send the men to gather up the pieces if I am wrong about him. But I do not think I am wrong about him. I have known a great many horses everyone had given up on. There is usually a reason a creature screams all night, and it is almost never that the creature is a devil. It is almost always that someone made it one." He was quiet a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he set the newspaper down altogether. "And what makes you so certain you can read a horse better than my grooms, who have handled beasts their whole lives?" She considered how much to tell him, and decided, because of the dark room and the name Toby, to tell him the truth. "Because for 3 years I had nothing else to do," she said. "Rook sold everything we had, and the horses went slowly, because horses take knowing to sell well. So for a while, I was the only one left who could gentle them. The frightened ones, the ones beaten stupid by grooms, who thought fear the same as respect. I learned you cannot force a frightened creature to trust you. You can only be very quiet, and very patient, and very fair, every single day, until one day it decides for itself that you are safe. And then it will give you everything." She met his eyes steadily. "It is slow work, but I have never yet met the creature it did not work on. Not one." She had meant it as nothing but the plain truth about horses. But she saw the words land in him, somewhere they were not aimed, saw him understand that she had just described, without meaning to, exactly what she had done to him in the dark the night before. Be very quiet, and very patient, and very fair. He looked at her, as though she were a language he had once known and forgotten. "Do as you like," he said at last, roughly, and took up his newspaper again, and hid behind it. But as she rose to go, he added, to the newspaper, and not to her, "Amos is the head groom. Tell him I said you are to have whatever you ask for. And Bryony." It was the first time he had used her name. It came out of him awkwardly, as though he had to think about where it went. "If that animal so much as lays back its ears at you, you will come out of the stall. That is not a request from your husband. That is an order from the man who owns the horse. Do you understand me?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," she said, and did not tell him that she had heard, underneath the order about the horse, a man frightened for her safety, which was a thing no one had been in a very long time, and which she carried out to the stables with her like a small, warm coal cupped in her hands. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them named. She spent her mornings at the stables, and her afternoons, finding her slow way about the great cold house, and in the evenings, they ate at the same end of the long table, and sometimes, more and more, they talked. Not of anything that mattered at first. The weather off the fells, a tenant's leaking roof, the scandalous fatness of the library cat. But a house that has held its breath for 5 years cannot help but exhale a little when a window is opened. And Ravensfell was, very quietly, beginning to breathe. Mrs. Tolliver noticed it before either of them did. The housekeeper had served the family since before the fire, and she watched the new Duchess with the flinty suspicion of a woman guarding a wound, waiting for the stranger to prove herself one more taker. But she saw the fire lit in the breakfast room each morning without being asked. She saw the master set down his paper to argue with his wife about a horse. And one afternoon, unprompted, she brought Bryony a shawl of soft gray wool that had belonged, she said stiffly, to the old Duchess, and would only go to the moths otherwise, and left the room quickly before she could be thanked. It was not affection, not yet. But it was a door left on the latch, and Bryony had learned to be grateful for those. She thought of Ottilie every day, and wrote to her twice a week, bright, careful letters that gave nothing away, telling herself the marriage was made, the trust was safe, and Rook could do no more harm. She was wrong about that. But the wrongness was still some weeks off, and for now there was only the horse, and the slow thaw of the house, and a scarred man who had begun, without either of them remarking it, to wait for her at the foot of the stairs. The head groom, Amos, was a bandy-legged old man, with a face like a walnut, and no faith whatever in the new Duchess. He led her down the row of loose boxes with the sour patience of a man humoring a fool, stopped well back from the last stall, and folded his arms. "That's him, Your Grace. That's the Black Devil. I've told His Grace 100 times. That horse wants putting down, not gentling. He's cost one man his living, and near cost me mine. There's no wrong in him you can mend. He's bad clean through." Bryony did not answer. She was looking at the horse. He was, even wild-eyed and lathered and trembling in the corner of his box, one of the most beautiful animals she had ever seen. A true black, 16 hands and more, with the deep chest and proud arched neck of old Spanish blood, a great fall of tangled mane, and 4 white socks gone gray with filth no groom dared enter to clean. He had flattened himself into the corner at the sight of her, ears pinned, the whites of his eyes showing all round, and a low broken sound came out of him that was not quite a scream and not quite a whimper. He was not a devil. She had seen devils. This was terror worn down to the bone, and left there so long it had forgotten it was ever anything else. And there was something else. A small pale mark high on his near shoulder under the grime, half hidden by the mane. A brand. She could not see it clearly from the aisle, but something in the shape of it snagged at her, some familiar thing she could not place. And then Amos spoke again, and the thought slipped away. "Don't you go in there, Your Grace," Amos said, real alarm in his voice now. "His Grace will have my hide. Then His Grace and I shall quarrel about it, and you will be nowhere in it," said Bryony. "Bring me a stool and a handful of oats, then go away and leave us be. And whatever you hear, don't come in after me unless I call your name. Not the Duke either. This will take as long as it takes." It took a long time. She did not go into the stall the first day, nor the second. She sat on the stool in the open door of it, not looking at the horse, humming low and tuneless under her breath, letting a thin stream of oats fall from her hand to the straw, and waited. When he lunged at the bars, she did not move. When he screamed, she did not move. When he stood shaking and watching her with his ears flat, she did not so much as turn her head, because to a frightened creature, a steady gaze is the gaze of the thing that means to eat you, and she wanted him to learn, in his own time, that here at last was a thing in the world that wanted nothing from him at all. The Duke came, of course. He came the first afternoon with his jaw set, meaning to order her out, and she lifted one hand from her lap without looking round, a single flat gesture. Wait. And to his own surprise, he waited. And then he stayed, and came every day after, standing out of the horse's sight an hour, and sometimes 2, watching his wife sit motionless at the door of the stall that had beaten every man on the estate. And Erebus screamed less and less. On the 4th day, the horse ate from the straw a foot from her skirts. On the 7th, he ate from her open hand, his great velvet lip trembling against her palm, and then flung his head up and retreated to his corner, ashamed, as though caught wanting something. On the 11th day, she went into the stall. She heard behind her the sharp, indrawn breath of her husband, and the smaller sound of Amos gripping his arm to hold him still. She did not turn. She walked into the box, slow as spilled honey, her body turned side-on and small, her eyes down, murmuring the low, tuneless hum, and she stood beside the trembling animal and did not touch him. She only breathed. And after a long while, the stallion who had put 2 men in their beds and screamed away so many nights, lowered his enormous head and rested it, gently, wholly, against the shoulder of the woman in the gray gown, let out a long, shuddering breath, and was still. Bryony stood there in the straw, with the whole weight of the animal's ruined trust leaning warm against her, and she raised her hand at last, and laid it on his neck, and stroked him once, and felt the years of terror run out of him like water. When she led him out into the yard an hour later, cleaned and haltered, and following at her shoulder like a lamb, the whole household had gathered without meaning to. Grooms and maids and Mrs. Tolliver and old Holden, and they stood in a silent ring and stared as though watching the dead rise. And the Duke of Wrexholm looked at his wife leading the unleadable horse across the cobbles in the thin northern sun, and his scarred face was doing something it had plainly not done in years, and he did not try to stop it. "You gentled him," he said. His voice was strange. "No," she said. "I only waited for him to remember he wanted to be gentled. That is all it ever is." She stroked the black neck. "There was never anything bad in him, Your Grace. There was only fear that no one had the patience to outlast. It is a very common story. It is nearly always the same story." She was talking about the horse. They both knew she was not only talking about the horse. And the Duke looked at her across the sunlit yard, with his heart plainly breaking open in his chest, and could not summon a single word. That night, brushing the great creature down by lantern light, she pushed the tangled mane aside, and saw the brand plainly for the first time. A running hair above 3 small stars. Her hand went still on the brush. She had known that mark all her life. It was the mark her grandfather had burned into every horse bred at the old Weld stables, the mark that had stood on the flank of the pony she learned to ride at 6 years old. This was a Weld horse, bred by her own family, and sold again, and no one at Ravensfell could have known it. She stood with her hand on the horse's shoulder, and felt the first thread of something she did not yet understand, pull tight in the dark. She said nothing of it, but she did not forget it. She had learned, under Rook, never to forget a thing that did not add up. The world did not leave them alone for long. The world never does. It came first as gossip, drifting north the way smoke drifts. The county was talking. The scarred recluse of Ravensfell had married at last, and married strangely. A portionless weld girl wed within the week, with no banns read and no society present. Half the talk said she had trapped him. Half said he had bought her cheap for an heir and would tire of her by spring. All of it agreed on the one thing people always agree on, which is that a woman who rises above the station assigned to her must have done something shameful to manage it. "They are saying I am your mistress dressed as a wife," Bryony observed one morning, "and that I schemed my way to a coronet over your poor grieving objections. It is a good story. It has a villainess in it, and a wronged man, and a fall still to come. People do love a fall." The Duke lowered his coffee. There was a new thing between them these days, an ease that had crept up on them both without permission. "Does it distress you?" "Not in the least. A reputation is a thing you spend, Your Grace. It only pains a woman to lose it if she was saving it to buy something, and I am not shopping. There is very little left they can threaten me with. Let them talk. The horses do not read the papers, and Erebus thinks a great deal more of me than the whole of Cumberland does." He laughed at that. It still startled them both when he laughed, that rusty, unused sound. But it came more easily now, and it came only for her. The second thing that came from the world was not gossip, and it made neither of them laugh. It was a letter, and it was from her sister, and it had been smuggled out. Bryony knew it before she broke the seal, because the direction was in Ottilia's hand, but the seal was a stranger's, some sympathetic servant's, and the paper had been folded very small to be hidden. Her hands were not quite steady as she read. Ottilie wrote as a frightened girl of 16 writes, too brightly, insisting she was well, that Bryony must not worry. "Cousin Josiah is very kind," she wrote, "and has such plans for me. There is a gentleman, a friend of his, a Mr. Gaunt, a widower, who is to call within the month. And Cousin Josiah says a girl in my position cannot hope for better and must be grateful. And I am trying to be grateful. Truly, I am." And then, at the very bottom, crammed small, as though her hand had betrayed her, 4 words that had plainly not been meant to be written at all. "Please come for me." Bryony set the letter down on the breakfast table very carefully, and pressed both palms flat against the wood, and looked at nothing for a moment. "Bryony," the Duke's voice, sharp with sudden attention. "What is it? What has happened?" "My cousin means to marry my sister off for money," she said, and her voice came out flat and cold and terrible, the voice of a woman closing a door on her own fear so that she could think. "As he sold everything else we ever had, there is a widower of his own age with money enough to make it worth his while. Ottilia is 16, and she has written to ask me to come for her, which she has far too much pride to do unless she were very much afraid." She looked up, and her eyes were dry, which was worse than weeping. "And I cannot go. I have no money of my own. Under the law, she is Rook's ward until she comes of age or marries, and he will marry her to his friend, precisely to be rid of the question. I wed you to save her fortune, and it may be I have only bought her a slower ruin." The Duke did not answer at once, but it was not the empty silence of a man who does not care. It was the dense, gathering silence of a man beginning, very quietly, to become extremely dangerous. She did not yet know him well enough to read it. She would learn. The knock came 3 days later, in the middle of a gray afternoon, and it was the wrong sort of knock, not the heavy, measured knock of a tenant, but a rapid, imperious rattle, the knock of a man who has practiced looking important. Bryony was in the library with the Duke, their heads bent close over the stud book, arguing pleasantly about whether Erebus might be put to one of the Ravensfell mares in the spring. They both looked up. She heard Halden's measured tread in the hall, and then a lighter, quicker voice, raised and confident, and her whole body went cold and still. "I know that voice," she said. The library doors opened. "A Mr. Lionel Rook," Halden announced, in the tone of a man announcing a bad smell, "who declines to wait." Lionel Rook came in on the butler's heels, in a coat of primrose yellow and a waistcoat embroidered with silver pheasants, a young man of perhaps 25, who had inherited all his father's greed and none of his father's cunning, so that where Josiah counted his coins in the dark, Lionel wore his on his back. He stopped short at the sight of the room, the vast, dark library, the enormous, scarred man rising slowly from the table, and for an instant his confidence flickered. Then he found Bryony, and rallied, and smirked. "Cousin Bryony, or must I say, your grace now." He sketched a bow so shallow it was an insult. "How grand you have become. My father sends his regards, and a word of caution, which I have ridden a very long way in poor weather to deliver, so I will thank you to hear it." "You will address my wife," said the Duke, from further off than that. Lionel's eyes went to him, and skittered from the scarred jaw, the ruined hand, and came back to Bryony, whom he plainly judged the safer mark. "It is only friendly counsel between family. You will have had a letter from the younger Miss Weld, full of foolishness, no doubt." He watched Bryony's face as he said it, and she gave him nothing, and it visibly disappointed him. "My father wishes it understood that Ottilie's future is entirely his affair, as her guardian, and that any interference from this quarter would be most unwise. And should the new Duchess do anything so rash as to try to remove the girl, or to blacken my father's good name, well," he spread his manicured hands, "it would be a great pity if a court of chancery were to hear that the Weld woman's own marriage was a sham, cynically got up, a fraud upon a dead man's will. Such a whisper would void a great many things. It would send a certain trust into the hands of its administrator entire. My father does so like to be thorough." There it was, then, laid bare on the library floor in a primrose coat. The whole snare and every wire of it, spoken aloud by a fool too vain to know he was showing them the trap. Bryony understood now exactly what Rook wanted, and exactly why, and she felt the old cold fury settle over her like a familiar cloak. She opened her mouth to answer. She did not get the chance. The Duke of Wrexholm crossed the room. He did not hurry. He simply crossed it, and the size of him seemed to grow with every step, and he took Lionel Rook by the primrose collar in his ruined right hand, the drawn and terrible hand, and lifted until the young man stood on his toes and the silver pheasant strained across his chest. "Listen to me very carefully," the Duke said, and his voice was almost gentle, which was the worst thing about it, because I will say at once, you will ride back to your father, and you will tell him that Bryony is not a Weld any longer. She is the Duchess of Wrexholm. She is mine. And her sister, from this hour, is under my protection also, whatever your law says. And I have a great deal more money to spend on lawyers than your father has to spend on hiding what he has done with a trust that was never his. Tell him that. Tell him the Duke of Wrexholm said that if he sells that child to anyone, he will answer for it, and for a great deal else besides, and he had best begin to wonder how carefully I have been reading." He set Lionel down and smoothed the ruined collar with a horrible mockery of courtesy. "Now, you will get off my land. Halden, Mr. Rook is leaving. See that he does not stop." Lionel went white, and then red, and then he went, backing and stumbling out of the room with the last of his bluster in rags around him. The great front door boomed shut behind him. Bryony stood in the sudden ringing quiet and found her heart was beating very hard, and not with fear. Her husband had just called her his in a voice like the closing of a vault, and had set his own name and fortune between her sister and ruin without a breath of hesitation. And she did not know what to do with the thing rising in her chest, because it had been so many years since anyone had stood in front of her instead of behind her, that she had half forgotten it was possible. "You should not have promised that," she said quietly. "You do not know what he is capable of." "No," the Duke agreed, his eyes on the door the young man had fled through, and something cold and certain had come into his scarred face. "But he doesn't know what I am capable of either. He's about to learn. So, I think, is his father." The fire came in the last week of October, in the black hour before dawn. A lantern kicked over by a restless cart horse, a heap of dry straw, a rising wind off the fells. By the time the stable boy's screaming woke the house, the whole far end of the mews was a wall of flame, and the wind was driving it down the row of loose boxes toward the good horses, and toward the last box of all, where a black stallion who had learned at terrible cost to fear nothing in this world except fire was flinging himself against the bars and screaming the way he had on Bryony's wedding night. She was in the yard in her nightgown before she had properly woken, her feet bare on the freezing cobbles, and the heat hit her like a wall, and she did not stop. Grooms ran with buckets in a hopeless chain from the trough. Amos was hauling terrified horses out by their halters 2 at a time, his face black and his brows gone. And down at the burning end, cut off now by a curtain of flame across the aisle, Erebus screamed. "He's trapped!" Amos bellowed over the roar. "The aisle's afire, Your Grace! We can't reach him! There's no way through!" There was a way through. Bryony could see it. A narrow gap along the far wall, where the flame had not yet crossed. Room for a slim person to reach the black horse's box and bring him out the back. It would close in a minute. She did not think. She had never in her life been able to stand and watch a creature scream. She pulled her nightgown up over her mouth and ran for the gap. Behind her, over the roar of the fire, a man's voice tore itself raw, screaming her name. The Duke of Rexholm had stopped at the edge of the firelight, and he could not move. He had not moved since he came out of the house and saw the flames. He was not in the yard at all. He was 5 years gone, in another fire, in the north wing, with the beam coming down and the heat searing his hand as he clawed at the fallen timber, and his brother's voice on the far side of it growing weaker, then stopping. The whole of him had locked, the way a wound locks. His body had decided 5 years ago that it could not go toward fire, and had never once let him overrule it. He stood useless as a stone, and hated himself with a completeness no scar had ever managed. And then his wife ran into the fire. He saw her small figure slip into the gap along the burning wall, going where he could not go. And something broke in him older and deeper than the terror. He had stood outside a fire once before, and let it keep someone he loved, and had sworn, kneeling in the ash afterward with his hand in ruins, and Toby gone, that if ever the choice came again, he would sooner burn than live through the after of it a second time. The choice had come to him again. The Duke of Rexholm went into the fire. He did not remember crossing the yard. He remembered the gap, the heat closing over him like water. And then he was in the burning aisle, and the black stallion was rearing in its box with Bryony at its head, fighting the bolt, and the flame had crossed behind them and sealed the way she had come. She turned and saw him, and her face in the firelight was pure astonishment. "The bolt is fused," she cried. "I cannot get the leverage." He put her aside with one arm and took the red-hot iron bolt in his ruined right hand, the hand that could barely feel, and wrenched it back with the strength of a man who has decided this fire will not have anyone tonight. The box flew open. Erebus burst out, and Bryony caught the halter and turned the great terrified animal toward the back doors and the cold air beyond. And the three of them went out together through the smoke into the dark yard and the merciful rain that was, at that very moment, beginning at last to fall. They put the fire out by dawn. They lost the far end of the mews, but no person and no horse, and the black stallion stood shivering and singed and alive in the far paddock, his head buried against the Duchess's shoulder, while she murmured to him in the rain. And the Duke sat where he had fallen, on the wet cobbles at the edge of the yard, and looked at his right hand, burned now across the palm over the old burns, and didn't feel it at all, and began, silently, in the gray light, to weep for the first time in 5 years. Bryony came to him. She did not exclaim over the hand, though it was a dreadful thing to see. She did not tell him he had been brave or foolish, or that all was well. She knelt in front of him in her ruined nightgown and took that terrible burned hand gently between her own two, and held it as though it were an ordinary hand, the way she had held everything at Ravensfell that everyone else had given up on. "Tell me about Toby," she said quietly. "Not how he died. I do not want to know how he died. Tell me what he was like." And the Duke of Wrexholm, kneeling in the ash and the rain with his hand in his wife's hands, told her. He told her about the boy with the laughing eyes, who could not sit a horse to save his life, and loved them anyway. Reckless and warm and alive in a way Alaric, careful and cold and dutiful, had never known how to be, and had loved him fiercely for. He told her about the night of the fire, and the beam, and the thing he had carried 5 years, which was not grief he could have borne, but guilt, the certainty that a warmer and braver man would have got the boy out. He told her all of it, and she listened, and did not flinch, and did not pity him. And when he had finished, she said the only true thing there was to say. "You went into the fire tonight," she said. "You are not a man who does not go into the fire. You are only a man who could not go in twice for the same brother. That is not cowardice, Alaric. That is a wound. They are not the same thing, though I know they feel the same from the inside." He looked at her. The dawn was coming up gray and clean behind her, the rain in her hair, and she was the least beautiful and most magnificent thing he had ever seen. And he understood, kneeling there, that he had stopped despising her so long ago he could not remember doing it, and that what had grown in its place had grown quietly all this while, patient and fair, the way she had told him such things grow, until one day the creature decides for itself that you are safe and gives you everything. "Bryony," he said. It was all he could manage. "I know," she said, and she leaned in, there in the ash, and kissed him, and he kissed her back like a man coming in from the cold at last. Josiah Rook came to Ravensfell himself in the 2nd week of November, which told Bryony, before he had said a single word, that his son's report had frightened him badly. He came in a hired carriage with a lawyer of his own beside him and a leather case of papers on his knee, come to finish the thing one way or another, because a snare that has been noticed is no longer a snare, but only a rope waiting to be turned on the man who holds it. They received him in the great library, and it was very different from the day Bryony had first stood dripping in that room. She stood now beside her husband, not below him, and the black stallion's new saddle lay across a chair where she had been working oil into the leather, and there was no fear anywhere in her at all. Rook had brought his smile. She had forgotten how much she hated it. "Cousin Bryony, you are looking very well. Marriage agrees with you, whatever its origins." He inclined his head to the Duke. "Your Grace, I will come to the point, as I am a busy man. There has been a great deal of unpleasant talk and unpleasant threats made to my son, and I am here to settle matters between families before they become matters between lawyers. I am a reasonable man. I have always been a reasonable man." "You have 1 minute to say what you came to say," said the Duke. Rook's smile tightened, but held. "Very well. Bluntly, then. This marriage is a fragile thing, Your Grace, and we all know it. Contracted in haste, under a dead man's compulsion, entered into by a woman with every motive of gain. I need only stand up in a court of chancery and question its good faith, and the trust that Bryony married to protect will freeze in litigation for years, and her sister be ruined, past mending in the meantime, and your own name, forgive me, be dragged through every drawing room in England once more. Nobody wants that. I certainly do not." He opened his soft hands. "So I propose a settlement. You pay to me, privately, the sum of £15,000 in consideration of my releasing all claims and my guardianship of the younger girl. I go away. The talk dies. Everyone is content. It is a very small sum to a man of your fortune, and it buys you a very great peace." The room was quiet. "You are selling me my own sister," said Bryony, "with money, back to me, having stolen her in the first place." "I am offering everyone a great convenience," said Rook smoothly. "Sentiment aside." The Duke moved then, and what he did wasn't what Rook expected. He did not rage, and he did not reach for the man. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and drew out a leather case a good deal fatter than the one on Rook's knee, and set it down on the table between them with a soft and final weight. "I have been reading," the Duke said. "I told your son I had been reading. You should have listened." He opened the case. "When a man threatens my wife, I make it my business to know him entirely. My solicitor has spent 2 months among the records of the Weld Trust. It is remarkable, Rook, what a determined man may find. Rents collected and never entered. Timber sold, and the proceeds vanished. A silver service pledged against a loan you took in the girls' names and kept for yourself. And the horses." He glanced at Bryony, and something passed between them, because this was the part she had given him. "My wife recognized one of them. There is a black Spanish stallion in my stables, bought 2 years ago at a sale in the north by an agent, out of a consignment sold under your own hand. He carries a brand on his shoulder. It is the Weld brand. You sold that horse, Rook, along with a dozen others, as your own property, to line your own pocket. And the animal standing in my paddock this minute is evidence in law that you have been disposing of trust property for private gain. That is not mismanagement. That is embezzlement and forgery and theft from minor children in your care, and any one of the 3 will transport you, or at the very least, see you in a debtor's prison for the rest of your natural life." Rook had gone the color of tallow. His own lawyer had begun, very quietly, to edge his chair away from his client. "You would not," Rook whispered. "The scandal. Your own name. My name has survived worse than you. I find I no longer greatly care what drawing rooms say of me. My wife taught me that. She does not read the papers either." Rook's smile had gone entirely now. Something uglier came up beneath it, the thing that had always been there under the softness, and he turned it on Bryony, because she had always been the easier mark. "This is your doing," he said, low and venomous. "You sly, watchful creature. You sat in my house 3 years with your eyes down and your mouth shut, and all the while you were counting, were you not? Just like your mother. Ungrateful to the last." "Yes," Bryony said. She did not flinch. She had waited 3 years to say it, and found, now the moment had come, that her voice was perfectly steady. "I was counting. I counted every horse you sold that was not yours to sell. I counted the tenants you turned out in the winter, and the coins you took from a dead man's daughters, and called it guardianship. I counted all of it, Cousin Josiah, and I remembered, because I learned young, that men like you never expect the quiet one in the corner to be keeping the ledger. You taught me that yourself. It seems a great pity to you now, I imagine, that you did. For a moment Rook could not speak at all. The Duke closed the case. Here are my terms, and they are not open to your reasonable adjustment. You will sign today, before your own lawyer as witness, a full renunciation of the guardianship of Ottilie Veld and of every claim upon the trust, and you will make good from your own estate every shilling you have taken from it, and Ottilie will come to live under my roof this side of Christmas. In return, I will not send what is in this case to the magistrate. That is the whole of my mercy, and it is a great deal more than you have earned. And if you say one word to me now, that is not the word yes, I will withdraw it and ring for the constable instead. The clock ticked. Josiah Rook looked at the fat leather case, and at the stallion's saddle on the chair, and at the faces of the Duke and Duchess of Wrexholm, who watched him without heat and without mercy and entirely without fear. And the reasonable man understood at last that he had come north to spring his own snare, and had put his foot in it to the knee. Yes, said Josiah Rook. He signed everything before he left. It took an hour. Bryony watched every stroke of the pen, and when it was done, and the carriage had gone back down the long drive into the November dusk, she stood in the great hall where she had once stood, dripping and afraid, and found that she was shaking, and that her husband's arm had come around her, warm and certain, and that for the first time in as long as she could remember, there was nothing left in all the world that she was afraid of. That evening, when the house was quiet, the Duke of Wrexholm did the hardest thing he had done since he walked into the fire. He found her in the library, and he stood before her like a man about to give away the only thing he owned. And he said, "Bryony, it is over now. Rook is finished, and your sister is safe, and you have done everything you married me to do." He drew a breath. "You were forced to this. Sold to me by a dead man and a snare, with no more choice in it than I had. I have thought a great deal about what that makes me, if I keep you now, having married you in anger, and used you to break your cousin. And I find I cannot do it." He took a folded paper from his coat, and set it in her hands. "There is a house in the Dales, and an income no one can ever take from you, and a home for you and Ottilie both, free of me and of Ravensfell, for the rest of your lives. The marriage need be a marriage in name only. You may live as you please. You are not a debt any longer, and you are not a prisoner, and you are not mine. You are only, at last, free. I wanted you to have the choosing of your own life. You never once had it. So here it is." Bryony looked down at the paper in her hands, at the freedom he had bought her at the cost of himself, and understood exactly what it had taken him to offer it, and loved him so much in that moment that she could scarcely breathe. She set the paper down on the table, unread. "Ask me a question, Alaric," she said. He looked at her, uncertain. "What?" "You have given me a great many things tonight. A house, an income, my freedom. But you have not asked me a single question, and I find questions are the only things in this world I truly trust, because they are the only gifts that let a person answer for herself." She stepped close to him and took his ruined hand in both of hers, as she had taken it in the ash and the rain. "You asked me nothing when you married me. You told me to keep to my rooms. Ask me now. Ask me what I want." His gray eyes searched her face. "What do you want?" he said, low. "I want to stay. Not because a will compels me, or a snare, or a debt, or a duty. All of those are finished tonight, and I am glad of it, because now, when I tell you that I choose you, you will know it is true, having given me every means to choose otherwise. I do not want the house in the Dales. I do not want to be free of you. I have been alone and unwanted my whole life, Alaric Hale, and I did not know it, because I had made myself hard so it would not hurt, the way that horse made himself a devil so no one could break him. And then, a grim and scarred and impossible man moved my chair one place up his table and could not tell me why. And I found I did not want to be hard anymore. I want to be your wife. I want to argue with you over the stud book and gentle your horses and say your brother's name at your table until this house forgets how to be a tomb. I want you. I am not a debt being paid. I am a woman who has chosen, freely, for the first time in her life. Will you have me? That is my question. The Duke of Wrexholm, who had armored himself against tears and coaxing and fear and every soft thing in the world, and had been undone in the end by nothing more than a woman who asked the right questions in the dark, pulled his wife into his arms, and gave her his answer without any words at all. Otillie came to Ravensfell before Christmas, a bright, frightened girl who stopped being frightened within a fortnight, because it is hard to stay frightened in a house full of horses and dogs, and a sister who loves you, and a grim brother by marriage who pretends to grumble and secretly teaches you to drive a gig. The talk in the county changed, as talk does, once it became clear the marriage would not conveniently fail. In time, it forgot to be scandalized at all, and remembered instead that the Duchess of Wrexholm could gentle any horse in the north, and was, when all was said, the best thing to happen to that unhappy house in living memory. On Christmas night, with Otillie asleep upstairs and the snow coming soft against the windows, Bryony asked Alaric to tell her a story about Toby. And he did, haltingly at first, and then not haltingly at all. A foolish story about a boy and a borrowed pony, and a frozen pond that ended with them both laughing. Halden, passing in the corridor with the coal scuttle, stopped quite still, because no one under that roof had heard the dead boy's name spoken with laughter in 5 long years. The house was learning to say him again. That, Bryony thought, listening to him laugh, was the only monument a person ever needed. Not a shut wing and a silence, but a name said easily at a warm table by someone unafraid of it. In the spring, they began to rebuild the north wing. Bryony found her husband standing in the ruin one green morning, looking up at the empty sky where the roof had been, and she slipped her hand into his, the ruined one, which he no longer hid from her, and asked him what he was thinking. That I have kept it a grave for 5 years, he said, because I did not know how to make it anything else, and that I should like to make it a nursery one day, and that I should like to hang Toby's portrait in the hall where the light is good, so that everyone who comes here has to learn his name. He looked down at her. You did that. You walked into a dark room and asked me one question, and you have been quietly rebuilding the whole of me ever since, brick by brick, and I do not think you even meant to. I never mean to, Bryony admitted. It is only that I cannot walk past a broken thing. It is a great failing in me. My whole life has been ruined creatures leaning their weight against my shoulder in the dark. Then I am in excellent company, said the Duke of Wrexholm, and kissed his wife in the ruin of his old grief in the spring light, with a black stallion grazing quiet in the paddock beyond, and the whole rebuilt future of them stretching out green and unafraid, and neither of them ever cold again. Did the quiet triumph of Bryony and her scarred duke leave you warm inside tonight? There is nothing in all the world quite as satisfying as watching a guarded, grieving man finally meet the one person patient enough to wait for his heart to remember it wanted to be found. If this story of a forced marriage that grew into a true one moved you, please tap the like button to help the channel grow. Share it with anyone who loves a fierce, tender heroine and a wounded hero worth the mending. And be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next romance. Tell me your favorite moment down in the comments below.